Good afternoon, everybody. This video is brought to you by Valley Hopper and the Upstate New York Cultural Revolution Committee in anticipation of Brownville 200, the bicentennial of the incorporation of the village of Brownville, New York. See the video's description for our information. Also in the description of this video is the free and official Rattery family driving/walking tour of Brownville and vicinity. But for the main event, the main attraction of today, the Rattery family tragedy and its anniversary. So, at around noon on March 1st, 1896, 130 years ago to the day, Charles Phelps of Brownville, New York, made a grim discovery. The nearly unconscious body of William Rattery spread out on the ground near the door of the house he shared with his sister Celia and brother Charles. The moon was a waning gibbous in Virgo. It was a leap year, and February 29th was the last normal day on Earth for the Rattery siblings. It was also an election year. The tail end of Grover Cleveland's second term, right there, was marred by economic depression and American political restructuring. You had William McKinley and his Gold Cross beating Mr. Free Silver, William Jennings Bryan, in November of that year. Their pictures right there. There's Grover Cleveland. And the first modern Summer Olympic Games were held for about a week and a half in Athens in April, about a month after the siblings' deaths. The paper industry in 1896 was continuing to expand and consolidate in the village, and Brownville was a well-established industrial suburb of neighboring Watertown. This picture is undated from what I could tell, give or take around 1896. The mills weren't fully in their kind of corporate consolidated form that if you were to go to Brownville you see today. But this is like kind of right before that happened. As you can see, there was a lot of crude general industry taking place in the village, but these paper markets were expanding across the continent and globe, so this industrial landscape started to favor companies and corporations rather than the kind of strike it out for yourself individual entrepreneurship that you associate with this kind of early Brownville. The siblings were some of the last living members of the Rattery family. They were one of the first black families to make the village of Brownville their home. As reported in the Watertown Daily Times on March 4th, 1896, Mr. Phelps was able to rouse William Rattery and bring him inside. In the house, Phelps and Rattery find Sister Celia, cold in death, on the floor next to a cot, and brother George, unconscious but still breathing nearby. So the person they find wasn't George, but Charles Rattery. They did have a brother, George Rattery, but he was a Civil War veteran who died 9 years prior and is buried in the Brownville Cemetery. They looked to the stove, and one of the lids was off, and the burning chamber was full of water. And the noticeable odor of coal gas was lingering in the air. So by this point, Celia was dead, and William and Charles were incapacitated. 3 days after the Watertown Daily Times published this article, they presented the public with a much more detailed update. On March 7th, William and Charles had both succumbed to their asphyxiation injuries, which were hastened by their age and exposure to the cold on the night of the incident. According to this article, the Ratterys lived in a, quote, tumble-down cabin-like structure on the main street of the village. The structure allegedly consisted of a sitting room, kitchen, and woodshed on the ground floor with storage in the garret. The brothers shared a double bed in the sitting room, while Celia used a cot that was kept in the kitchen. In describing the siblings, the Times used sometimes harsh, though not necessarily violent, racialized language to characterize them. They write that Celia, although her hair is whitened with age and shoulders carried the weight of 80 years of toil, was content to earn a livelihood by any manner of housework. William was a man of all work, a general window washer and choreman for anyone who could pay him, and that Charles was a representative darky, born and reared a slave. He was a coachman and body servant. On March 5th, 1896, the Times had also republished an animating description of William Rattery that the Oswego Palladium had printed upon the news of their deaths. Quote, William Rattery was for many years the janitor of the Board of Trade Rooms, and besides was general window washer and man of all work in business offices in Water Street. He was a unique character and was probably more delighted by the sound of his own voice than any man in Oswego. If he could not find words long enough in the dictionary, he did not hesitate to coin words, long enough and euphonious enough for the most fastidious. He was a harmless character and well liked by businessmen. Their funeral was held on Saturday, March 7th, 1896, and was attended by many colored people of Watertown and Brownville. The two brothers were interred by the side of their sister's unmarked grave, and in the spring, quote, one gravestone will be sufficient to mark their resting place. Rather than being sent to die in the county poorhouse, Watertown's black community had procured a black doctor and nurses to care for William and Charles in their last days. One curiosity worth noting is that on the other face of this gravestone right here is the names of the Champlin family, which was another early black family in the village. I'm assuming that they're buried near the marker. There aren't any individual headstones, and that this was probably used as a communal marker of sorts, probably paid for by the same black church community who doctored the brothers and attended the funeral that are talked about in the newspaper articles. This is the Rattery, the rest of the Rattery family plot, I should say, in the Brownville Cemetery. This close-up shot is the grave of brother George Rattery, a Civil War veteran. And this is the Jefferson County almshouse, where William and Charles were going to be sent to die before the local black community came together to care for the brothers themselves and with dignity. So, as I move through these topics related to genealogy and family narratives, it will become abundantly clear that there are a lot of gray areas and guessing that takes place in lieu of confirming information. And there is a good chance that some of my understanding of the Rattery family origin story is probably skewed, misinformed, or just flat out wrong. For example, you can take the sibling's mother, Anne, and I've been operating under my own assumption that the woman Anne Robinson, who can be found with various Rattery siblings in the Brownville censuses, was their mother. However, Marjorie Perez of the Oswego County Historical Society found in her research a town clerk document relating to Civil War soldiers listing George H. Rattery's mother as Anne Burroughs, not Robinson. When we look at the Brownville census for 1830, we see that there is a Peter Burroughs living in the village of Brownville, and who seemed to have hung around the vicinity for another decade or so. Could this be Anne's brother? All of the Rattery children had been born by this point, though, and this doesn't provide any conclusive evidence of Anne Burroughs, but it gives us another mystery to try and chip away at. It's almost more information than I have for anything about Robinson, if I'm going to be completely honest, other than my own assumptions. So, it is also a possibility that the Robinson name became attached to Anne through some unknown social conditions or enumeration mistake. Through our continued research, we may one day be able to gain more understanding about this interesting piece of history, though. Unfortunately, the posthumous story of the siblings and their lives end up full of half-truths and inaccuracies that end up presenting a false origin story, one that will eventually be used to bolster another false narrative about the village's founding father, General Jacob Jennings Brown. This is in specific reference to a claim made in the March 7th Times article that the Rattery siblings were born into slavery and moved north without explanation to Oswego after the Civil War before locating to Watertown and then on to Brownville, where they purchased their cabin for $100. Most of this information is false or misconstrued. And although the family was a fixture in the village for over 70 years, it will become painfully obvious that very little evidence of the family's existence has survived into the 21st century. The complexities, primarily biases in recording and preservation, of Black genealogy and history forces us, in the examination of timelines and narratives, to accept loss as a foundational component of telling these stories. We are forced to take an approach based on the understanding and acceptance of narrative gaps and voids of information. With that being said, yes, the goal here is to straighten some things out, to unpack dormant mythologies, and reanimate the local landscape in their retellings, all to better understand or appreciate hidden dimensions of place in our efforts to build a generative, well-adjusted, upstate future society. In terms of local Black history, there's a lot that comes to mind. To the west of Brownville and Dexter, Jesse Babcock, a cotton factory superintendent and industrialist, used his house as a northern node on the Underground Railroad, with the journey to Canada via the St. Lawrence River the end goal. There are, in the early settlement of the region, actual accounts of slavery. We can think of Henry Barr, a Kentucky-born slave, and his 3-story brick commercial block eventually made obsolete by the double-decker Court Street Bridge and was demolished in the 1980s. Sugar Ray Robinson was bestowed his nickname after a fight in Watertown, and the everyday lives of the county's Black community all have contributed to the idea of a local Black history. More than anything, though, that represents the greater Watertown region's Black history is the Thomas Memorial AME Zion Church and the race to preserve the structure. Built in 1909, the congregation, which organized in 1880, had been meeting on the corner of River and Court Streets near the bar block, kind of around where the Guilfoyle ambulance garage is, near the south side of the modern Court Street Bridge. I can only assume that the Rattery family was familiar with this congregation in the later years of their lives based on newspaper clippings and obituaries. The original church trustees were composed of men who settled in the region after the Civil War: David A. Williams, Joseph Rickman, and Henry Barr. Under the leadership of Frank Thomas and the financial support of certain community organizations, the congregation, many of whom were railroad workers, worked together to mold the concrete blocks of the Gothic Revival structure on Morrison Street. The church, situated in a community with a Black population of less than 10%, the church served as a symbol of heritage and acted as a support system that responded to the social and political environments of the time up until services stopped. The community still exists and is still strong. For more information about the efforts to preserve the Thomas Memorial AME Zion Church, preservation in color, and North Country Black history, please see the description for the Rattery Family Walking Tour map link. The Rattery family is an integral component of Jefferson County Black history. So the first documentation of the Rattery family living in the village of Brownville can be found in the New York State Census of 1820, where John Rattery and his family are listed as living in the village. John, born around 1790, had come to Jefferson County sometime around when this census was taken. Samuel Brown Jr. and George Brown Jr. both had one, quote, other person except Indian not taxed living with them in the 1810 census. For the most part, this category most often refers to free Black people, but Laura Lynn Scherer, in her research on African Americans in Jefferson County, had only mentioned there being free Black people in the town of Champion in the 1810 census. So, I don't know. That's the image to the right, a transcription. I don't know exactly in column L what those two individuals, who they were. If they weren't free Black people, it could technically represent non-citizen residents or mixed-race residents, and there were no uniform census forms at this point which furthered complications of interpretation at large. But having come to the village on an early trip in May 1799 from Pennsylvania with, quote, servants and boatmen, there is perhaps a theoretical possibility that John Rattery was one of these persons living / enumerated with either Samuel or George Brown Jr. There is no definitive way of knowing this without finding proper documentation. You can see John Rattery's name to this left census in the 1820 census at the bottom of the image, but if you look at the other village heavy hitters that he was neighbors with, it's pretty impressive. You have General Jacob Brown, hero founder, William S. Ely, the village's first president in 1828, Judge John Brown, the general's brother, and Samuel Brown. It appears that with Anne, Robinson, or Burroughs, Rattery, they had 7 children, including Celia, John, and Charles, living with them based on their birthdays in the census enumeration. This was a particularly unique time in the state for Black Americans. New York was still embarrassingly rolling out gradual emancipation, and men like John Rattery were in the middle of a process to be recognized as legitimate political agents. Brownville, too, in 1820 was a wild and interesting place. General Jacob Jennings Brown, now hero of the northern border, was still in town, and the post-war village had grown into quite the impressive pocket of industry full of former soldiers, hired hands, and New Englanders who moved west to try their hands at commerce and speculation. The Erie Canal hadn't been finished, though they would make sure to send a boat from Buffalo to Manhattan before full emancipation, and hopes were very high for a successful settlement on the Black River at Brownville. The specific conditions that brought the Rattery family to the village is still unknown, though, so don't impose them on this narrative, but this is an etching of the industry at Brownville around 1815, but it probably didn't look that much different in 1820. John maintains the household through the 1830 federal census. There are now 5 males and 3 females in the household. This is Peter Burroughs in the 1830 Brownville census. Remember, George Rattery listed Anne Burroughs as his mother, so this is another Black Burroughs surname living around Brownville. The numbers weren't that high. There has to be a connection. There has to be a connection. There's no direct Rattery household registered in the 1840 federal census, though. The closest we can get to potentially understanding the Rattery's whereabouts at this time is maybe they were living with Peter Burroughs in Sackett's Harbor, especially if Anne is related, because he had 7 total free-colored persons living with him. Or possibly in Brownville you had white Henry C. Lewis listing 8 free-colored persons living on his property as boarders. These are 2 possibilities in the 1840 census. The joys of uncovering all of this, again, this is almost it. There's really no more backup documentation than this, and it's, to me, it's pretty impressive that we have this. So John Rattery had probably died sometime between the 1830 to 1850 censuses, even though there's no death certificate and there's no marked grave. There's nothing that you can really find about him. It took until 1850 for the Rattery family to appear as a household on the Brownville census again, this time with house number 390, headed by Anne Rattery, born 1790 in New Jersey, and occupied by an Emma or Elson C. Rattery. Again, there are very interesting things going on with the census, because there are a few instances where different names pop up and the last name is attached. Those circumstances don't necessarily, in these cases, imply that there's always direct parentage. This could be. There's just nothing else about an Emma Rattery in the Brownville documentation, in the Oswego documentation. So this kind of runs its course. You don't hear about the Emma Rattery again. But There they are on the 1850 census in Brownville. Now, it is assumed that Celia, William, and Charles had left the village for a period. Their brothers John, Richard, and George all had established lives in Oswego County at various points, and there is enough documentation to confirm that Celia, Charles, and William all had significant stints in the county as well. Their late brother George Rattery, who served in Company F of the 26th Colored Infantry during the Civil War, lived and died in Oswego, but was buried in Brownville, where he was born, after he died. George was wounded in his left shoulder in July 1864 during the obscure Battle of Bloody Bridge, or Battle of Burden's Causeway, in which Union soldiers, many colored troops from both the North, like George, and his 26th, charged and overtook the Confederate rifle pits until they were driven out again. George found himself wounded but alive in the center of a symbolic, brutal, and passionate battle on Jones Island in South Carolina. The republished article from the Oswego Palladium noted that George was also well known in Oswego and was the body servant of Thomas S. Mott, a wealthy merchant, banker, and the grandfather of U.S. Representative Luther W. Mott, though this actually could have been John Rattery rather than George, because John was listed as living with the Motts in the 1870 census. John Rattery, John E. Rattery, not the father, brother John, lived primarily between Watertown, Brownville, and Oswego, and he operated an omnibus between the American Hotel at Watertown and the Davis Hotel at Brownville. These are some snippets from Oswego papers depicting the shenanigans that some of the Rattery brothers were up to. A lot of them seem to involve alcohol. And there is a description of George Rattery's funeral ceremony on the bottom left, in which the Brownville Legion gave his remains a military burial at the request of family and friends. I like this one. William Rattery, Charles Hort, and one Carney were in quarantine, sobering down and awaiting orders. Not the man. George Rattery says he is not the man who figured the police transactions on Monday. It was William Rattery of Pious Hollow. Just, love the papers. Why Oswego? I don't exactly know or understand the specific conditions that led the Rattery siblings to establish good portions of their adult lives in the greater Oswego area. There could have been, for instance, friends or neighbors from Brownville that they knew had moved there. They could have had family that we don't know about who were living there and invited them. Perhaps they were drawn to some social or cultural pull that they sensed or read about coming from the lakeside. But in theory, Brownville has always been connected to Oswego by way of Lake Ontario, through early military installations, and then eventually through an ever-expanding network of roads linking upstate communities, which, again, doesn't explain why they were there, but there were always connections, so anything's possible. During the siblings' lives, they would see railroads and other general improvements dramatically change travel and communication between the two places. When they were born, Brownville was still a northern frontier town buzzing with the energy of the War of 1812 and reliant on long trips by the lake or on crude, muddy roads through the state. By the time they died, telephones were starting to become common, and modern America was well on its way to defining itself. While the Rattery siblings, specifically William, Charles, and George, were living in Oswego, they were close to some incredible things. To their west, Frederick Douglass was printing his North Star paper. At home in Oswego, there was plenty of Underground Railroad activity. They were around for the lead-up to and aftermath of the Civil War. They saw the communities they resided in rise up from dusty frontier towns to modest industrial and economic centers. They watched their neighbors like George Franklin Grant become Harvard's first black faculty member and the inventor of the modern wooden golf tee. The Rattery family seemed to exist in the center of an electrifying world of change and contradiction. Interestingly, though, I found that James Cummings, a graduate student at SUNY Oswego, had written that, quote, although Oswego in its earlier days had considerable contact with black folks through its Underground Railroad, very few blacks had ever lived in Oswego. unquote. Please reach out to the Oswego County Historical Society for more information about all of this regional material. Although not without fluctuations, each census until the siblings' deaths in 1896 confirms an established Rattery presence at the village of Brownville, with Celia appearing most often as head of household. This is 1855. Here are some of the family members in the 1865 state census. You have Anne, Charles, and Cecilia. You'll see that a lot. Cecilia, Cornelia, Celia. I go with Celia because it's on the grave, but I've used all to do some research, and all have worked. This is them in the 1875 census, Celia and Charles, and 1880. The 1890 census was destroyed by fire in 1921. Using census and property records, as well as newspaper archives, we were able to get an idea about where the family was actually living in Brownville from at least 1865 on. So, in the 1855 New York census, there is a Sibva Robinson, born around 1775. I don't think that's an actual name. Excuse me. I think it's some misinterpretation. Listed as living with Anne, Charles, and Celia. But again, there's the Robinson last name, and we've seen the Anne Robinson name. That was where some of those connections were coming from. But in some census instances, Anne Robinson Rattery, Anne Robinson Burroughs Rattery, and Sibva Robinson had been listed as having both been born in New Jersey. And the other... So around this time, living near the Rattery household, on a map was the White Robinson family, who were also from New Jersey, which was another just curiosity. Robinson, New Jersey, Brownville. And just 5 years earlier in the 1850 federal census, living with the White T. Norton family is a roughly 70-year-old black woman named Old Lylyria, Lylyria. Again, I don't think this is actually a name or the name. I think it was something that was just written misnomer, because I assumed that to be the same person as Sibva Robinson, because the dates add up and the name structure seems similar, because there was also in an earlier transcription of Brownville history, Thomas Bowlesby allegedly had this enslaved woman or freed an enslaved woman in Brownville named Old Sylvie. So I was taking Sylvie, Lylia, Sibva, and all these dates seem to add up. Whoever this person was, whatever her name was, I think this is who that person is. And you can see it right here on the bottom. Old Lylyria, New Jersey. It's an interesting curiosity. Available maps when searching for Norton family property showed the land to be at the intersection of today's St. Lawrence Avenues and Pike Streets, right here at this little elbow. By 1864, the Rattery family household started to appear on these property maps on one of the Norton plots tucked near a stream of water that drained into Philomel Creek. I assume, though, because something we'll get to in a second, that they were just renting this property from the Nortons. Johnny Rattery, their brother, was living in a house kind of opposite and up the hill on St. Lawrence Avenue from the siblings. This house is either the same house or pretty much on the site of John Rattery's house. This is John Rattery's family in the 1850 census, and a notice regarding his omnibus services between Brownville and Watertown, which doesn't say the hotels, but it was the American Hotel in Watertown and Davis Hotel in Brownville, which I believe there were other hotels kind of closer to the train corridor in Brownville that were smaller that might have been the Davis Hotel. So eventually the Witt family acquired the Norton property, which you can see on the map. That elbow, Charles Witt now has the Norton property. So I'm not sure, because if you look, that you see John Rattery up there, and now Charles Witt. So I don't know if John Rattery was renting as well, if he purchased the house, what that happened, but now Charles Witt owns these two properties and the Rattery property. But in 1880, there is a public property transfer notice presented that lists Cornelia Rattery as the purchaser of a lot in Brownville for Mary M. Witt for $100. The siblings now actually owned their Brownville accommodations in 1880. Rather than being established on the main street of the village as the Watertown Daily Times had claimed, we see that the siblings actually occupied a rural nook in a scrubby far eastern corner of the village defined by limestone and water when they met their tragic fates. This is an image of the landscape near the siblings' home. It is a karst landscape, and there are caves and sinks throughout the area. There may have been quarrying operations undertaken in this vicinity. Part of me wonders whether or not some of the Brown Mansion or other limestone buildings or infrastructure in the village's vicinity was quarried from or right around here. This is a wide shot of the Rattery family section of Brownville. Celia, William, and Charles's accommodations were to the right, while brother John occupied a house opposite and up the hill closer to the church. First of all, disregard this. There's mistakes in here, and again, a lot of it's speculative, but the point is that the Rattery family doesn't end here. But, there were children that we know of. John Rattery had a daughter and possible stepchildren. George and his wife had two somewhat documented children who ended up in a Rochester orphanage. And though they have no listed children, William was married to his wife, Charlotte Rattery, on November 29, 1843, at Oswego's First Presbyterian Church. Charlotte is buried in that city's Riverside Cemetery. Mary K. Stone of the Oswego Historical Society, let me know that Mrs. William Rattery is listed on the original documents of the Oswego Public Library and is included in an exhibit related to early black patrons of the library. William was listed as a janitor at the Board of Trade, the port, which aligns with other information about William and his life in Oswego. All of this is to say that although the Rattery family line didn't necessarily end on March 1st, 1896, what was lost was the siblings' agency in the retelling of their story. On February 14th, 1919, just shy of 23 years after the deaths of Celia, William, and Charles, the Watertown Daily Times published a small, one-off local interest article titled "When First Slaves Were Brought Here," composed entirely from misinformation provided to the Times by Franklin D. Sieber, who was born in 1840, allegedly the second oldest living resident of Brownville. The article is centered around both several articles left by General Brown of the War of 1812 fame to his one-time slaves and talks he had with descendants of the Negroes who came to Jefferson County as slaves but were later liberated, unquote. In short, Sieber claims that General Brown, on the left, his daughter, Eliza, and her husband, Colonel Edmund Kirby, whose grave is right there on the right, in the Brownville Cemetery, brought the Rattery family to Brownville around 1824 after he was appointed to the Army's pay department and returned to the village. According to Sieber, although slavery had been almost effectively abolished, at least theoretically, in New York by this time, Kirby was allowed his slaves because a provision in the 1817 or 1819, an act relevant to slaves and servants, had allowed slaveholders with Southern citizenship to retain their slaves until July 4th, 1827. However, as stated in the story, when Kirby left Brownville again in 1832, he turned the Ratterys over to his father-in-law, General Brown, who emancipated them immediately. Brown actually died in 1828 and was living in Washington from 1821 until then. Frank Sieber then shifts his interest to possessions and property. He says that General Brown was known for his kindness to, quote, the black people, and deeded a house to Celia Rattery upon his death. She would have been 10, or 14 if we go by Sieber's dates, along with, quote, some of his more personal effects, as remembrances of him. As figures like Colonel Kirby and Mrs. Brown died, more of the family's trinkets fell to the erstwhile slaves. Before Celia died, the Times claimed that she wrote a will placing what had been left her entirely in the hands of Mr. Sieber to dispose of as he saw fit. Sieber sold most of the items, though he was not paying off all debts, as evidenced by a public document on the right, noting unpaid bills presented to Celia Rattery's estate that is now hosted on the Roswell Flower Memorial Library's website in perpetuity. But he did keep the best for himself. This photo on the left is just another example of Celia Rattery, the Rattery siblings, not having much in terms of material wealth. They owed money. They didn't have much of an estate. In this posthumous representation of the Rattery family, we see... got ahead of myself, but he describes a handmade coffee grinder, which was undoubtedly used by General Brown before and after the War of 1812, 2 brass lamps and 2 candlesticks of antique design and handwork he considers very valuable, a silk shawl of excellent material and workmanship which was the property of the General's wife, and the pay chest of Edmund Kirby, which was used at Sackett's Harbor during the War of 1812. The Ratterys were never mentioned in the Watertown papers ever again, and these objects described have yet to turn up. Included here are some images of items on display at the Brown Mansion. Edmund Kirby's medal and a flask owned by General Jacob Brown. But the items mentioned here never showed up. I think I saw somewhere that the pay chest was given to the old Jefferson County clerk, and there's no paper trail, so we really don't know what happened to these items, if they existed, etc., 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 let alone if they were connected to the Rattery family. But in this posthumous representation of the Rattery family by Frank Sieber, we see a twisting of narrative and meaning that both takes advantage of the siblings' lack of agency because they were dead, and a destabilization of all of Mr. Sieber's story. In jumbling almost every date mentioned, the Times article establishes a foundationally flawed timeline that ignores reality and turns the Ratterys into fictionalized folk objects that serve only to develop a false representation of the village's hero founder. According to Sieber, Edmund Kirby was allowed to retain his slaves because of his Southern citizenship. While Kirby had lived in Washington, he did not return to Brownville until after the death of General Brown in 1828. When the War of 1812 was finished, Kirby had been stationed in Detroit from 1815 to 1820, returning then to Brownville as the general's aide-de-camp and marrying his daughter Eliza in 1824. They all went to the village in 1821, where Jacob Brown died 7 years later. It wasn't until after Brown's death and the total abolition of slavery in New York that Edmund and Eliza returned to Brownville after their tenure in the South. That John Rattery's household appears in the 1820 and 1830 censuses, seemingly independent from Kirby or Brown influence, continues to disprove this Kirby-Brown slave narrative, while at the same time reiterating the fact that the family was just trying to carve out their existence in the North Country, regardless of the circumstances. Eliza's gravestone is in the center of the slide, and an act for gradual abolition of slavery flanks the Frank Sieber article. Again, the last wills and testaments of General Brown, his wife, and the Kirby family are all publicly available and bear no mention of any slaves, Ratterys, or generous donations to black families in Brownville. The Rattery family certainly had interactions with the Kirby and Brown families, It's been made quite clear that the family was known and appreciated in the small village, but there is no evidence of the Rattery family inheriting the properties of the Brown or Kirby families, further deflating the Edmund Kirby, Jacob Brown abolitionist myth. While Brown's Quaker upbringing, he wasn't much of an active Quaker in his adulthood, and wartime experiences most likely made him sympathetic to the problems of black people in America, there is no direct evidence corroborating any of the anti-slavery tales that begin to involve Jacob Brown in the first half of the 20th century, such as stories of non-existent tunnels running from Brown's limestone mansion in the village to the steep banks of the Black River used to hide runaway slaves, and the mansion's role as a stop on the Underground Railroad. I find it hard to believe that the most conspicuous structure in the village would be a good hiding spot. This retrospective myth-making helped polish the legacy of foundational pre-Civil War figures like Brown and align them with popular moral frameworks and narratives, in this case mostly posing an issue in a research context, as these folk myths have essentially died out in the community and exist only in an archival sense, but have presented larger challenges when applied to figures like George Washington and Ben Franklin. While the Rattery family history involves enslavement at some point, there is no evidence that the family were enslaved in Brownville, and certainly no proof that Edmund Kirby and Jacob Brown had anything to do with their introduction or freedom in Brownville. But what is more debatable, in my opinion, is the existence of rare or valuable cultural and historical items that the siblings had allegedly owned. Though no written or itemized wills were available, 3 probate court records exist which give Franklin D. Sieber control of Celia, Charles, and William's estates, respectively. This is Charles's page. This is Celia's, which is Cecilia. And this is William's page. It's clear that Franklin Sieber had some connection to the siblings. He was living near the head of Pike Street in 1888, but it is unclear as to why he would assume the burden of their estates if those objects didn't exist. From their obituaries and earlier newspaper gossip, including word of Celia receiving donation visits, it was established that the Ratterys did not have much in terms of material wealth, and property records don't show Sieber or his family developing the Rattery property on St. Lawrence Ave and Pike Streets. There is a continued effort being made to locate and confirm the existence of any of these items. If they happen to exist and connect to Sieber, then perhaps the point of this false narrative was to burnish the provenance of his relics. Not only did the general own these things, but he also bequeathed them to his slaves, who he also so lovingly set free. Maybe he just wanted a good story, or maybe there is a chance that those weird enumeration things in the 1810 census could have been John Rattery in some way, and it could be a genuine case of kind of a misremembered, jumbled story. But regardless of intention, Sieber's shaky folktales do no justice to Jacob Brown or the Rattery family. There are certainly dimensions of the story that haven't and may never come to light, but total accuracy was never our point. It is understanding place and narrative and meaning that we're after. The significance of the Rattery family story lies in its ability to touch on subjects like myth-making, place expansion, and narrative context. This is an image of an envelope I was able to purchase on eBay a year ago. It was probably written by Celia Rattery and sent to William while he was living and working in Oswego in the 1870s or 1880s. To have such a tangible piece of the Rattery family with us is still such an amazing thing. 130 years ago today, March 1st, at the intersection where Pike Street meets St. Lawrence Avenue in Brownville, New York, the Rattery family accidentally gassed themselves to death. Celia, William, and Charles Rattery lived to see Brownville incorporated as a village, emancipation in New York, early steamboat experiments in the village, the opening of the Erie Canal, the industrial development of Brownville, Watertown, and Oswego, the Civil War, emancipation in the United States at large, the development of the local paper industry, the telephone and telegraph, and more. They brush shoulders with every single person who helped make Brownville into everything that it was during the 20th century and have, themselves, I am certain, influenced the early life of Brownville in innumerable ways that we couldn't possibly understand today. The Rattery family is as Brownville as the Browns, the Elis, the Kilbournes, the Lords, the Skinners, etc. The Rattery family matters. 130 years ago, 200 years ago, today. Having stirred the siblings up from the papers, a slice of Brownville's cultural historical landscape is reanimated and thrown into the present. The dormant mythology of a hero founder and abstracted once slaves is prodded, recontextualized, and consumed again. With that energy, the energy of discovery and expansion, we can continue to push forward the place expansion agenda, an effort to establish rural cultural vitalization and future-oriented thinking through an intense analysis of regionality, meaning, and culture. Through this critical understanding of the past and its hidden mysteries or riddles, we are able to better understand our approach regarding the future, of the physical landscape, of local economy and governance, of culture and regionality, and the ways we can make a generative and useful new upstate society. Understanding the Rattery family is a step in understanding Brownville. Understanding Brownville is a step in the regional revolution. Lay some flowers, crack some books, dig your well. Thank you for tuning into this presentation on the 130th anniversary of the Rattery family tragedy in Brownville. Remember to check out the description for the official Rattery family tour of Brownville and vicinity. This project is brought to you by Valley Hopper and the Upstate New York Cultural Revolution Committee in anticipation of Brownville 200, the Village of Brownville, New York's municipal bicentennial. More information on Valley Hopper, Brownville 200, New York culture, and the regional revolution in the description. Remember the Ratteries. Good night.